I'm Youth Meaning everyone, Benny Cosmic here, your subconscious, with another insightful video. If you missed the last one, the link to it will be in my description, and along with all the other ways you can stay connected with me so that we can keep forming and building this community. Remember, if you're seeing this for the first time and you want to be able to, support because you're gaining value from it, then all you got to do is hit like, subscribe, or, hit the little bell for notifications and share it out to people. That way we can keep these videos going. I am aiming to make this full time. So again, thank you so much for your support. All that being said, let's get into it. That leads me to my next topic, Indigenous animal medicine. After learning about semiotics, I realized that at its core, it's pattern recognition. So I couldn't help but notice the practices being utilized years before its conception by our indigenous ancestors, and potentially in other tribal societies who practice, animism and living in unison with the land. Disclaimer, I am a Kumeyaay tribesman, so I can and do not claim to be an accurate representation of all the Turtle Island tribes. There's just a lot of us and we all got our own thing going on. I only aim to highlight the culture and remind the rest of the world, well, we're still here, and that our wisdom was well beyond modern science in a handful of ways. I've had this book, Medicine Cards, by Jamie Sands and David Carson, since I was 18, and I'm 29 now. And at every point in life, this book and his wisdom has been applicable. It was a gift to me from my late grandmother, my Nana, Rose Montoya. Rest in power. I love you. You're still with me. And in fact, I actively do readings and offer it for people who are searching, So if you're interested in that, you can reach out to me through however you want to. The premise and purpose of this book is as follows. The two authors are members of the Wolf Clan, and part of their lives' journey was to teach the masses to raise their consciousness. And in that pursuit, they took the time to, learn from elders of the Choctaw, the Lakota, the Seneca, Aztec, Yaqui, Cherokee, the Cheyenne, the Iroquois, the Mayan tribes. Of course, those are just a handful of hundreds of tribes. This is where semiotics comes into play. You see, since most of our cultures vary, they had to find the parallels between the teachings to highlight the oneness that we all are in. And in the message, I'm letting it be known that the authors also acknowledge that these are surface level introductions to very heavy spiritual practices, and implore truth seekers to dive into them on their own and of their own volition to make sure you get what you truly need from it. Since I think it's easier to see the parallels I'll be getting into by knowing what you're actually looking for, let's start with some of the terms in semiotics. For instance, signs mean anything that indicates and represents something else, and that something else would be the object of the sign. And that sign doesn't necessarily have to be an image. It could also be a vibe. Like the smell of a rose may represent the entire idea of a rose in your mental imaging faculties. Or to further break that down, there's three types of signs. So there's icon, there's index, and symbols, which a good example being a picture of somebody that the picture itself is an icon representing the person. You could also be a map, and that would be representing the land in which you're trying to represent. So a map would be an icon of the land. Moving forward from there, there's index, which has an implied relationship with an object that usually have a logic to it, like someone sweating could indicate that the weather is hot outside. Or let's say you go and see and smell smoke, then you could use that as an index that there is fire nearby. And then, of course, we have symbols. And symbols, they're more so inherently connected to an object, meaning that it's based off of a conventional use that any given society has for it. Which, a good example would be indigifolk, a term that I'm coining for the culture, have the medicine wheel, which has several layers of symbolism within itself that has been refined by hundreds of tribes to fit the context of their day-to-day while still being accessible to others. Another example could be a crucifix and robes that could represent Eve, religious dogma of the Christian faith. And now that I think about it, words in general, just words, are symbols because we use words to represent abstract thoughts. Everything's an abstract thought. We just use words to point them out and try to, make it more finite out of the infinite. How does this apply to indigenous animal medicine? Well, I'm glad that you asked. You see, the practice of finding your totem animals or spirit animals used to be seen as a major rite of passage, signifying that an individual was ready to honor and serve their community, as opposed to most people's introduction being some sort of hallucinogenic experience at like a festival where a butterfly landed on you and that's your whole personality now. Looking at you, Becky. That being said, the general practice would be to approach the elders in council, usually 6 folks, 3 of the feminine on the right-hand side and 3 of the masculine on the left-hand side. And the idea was to enter from the south while the elders sat in the north. That in itself symbolizing growth and ascension while reconciling the balance of divine feminine and masculine that reside in the left and right sides of the brain. While simultaneously, a fire roared in the center whose light would guide, while also casting shadows to highlight and outline the great mystery, so that you may walk the path towards your own inner secrets. And as this happened, an elder who was either feminine or masculine, depending on the individual's affinity towards one or the other, would approach with a medicine bag filled with different animal parts, such as wolf fangs, bear claws, crow feathers, etc., with each had a symbolized meaning specific to the spiritual metaphysical properties associated with those animals. So think in terms of the loyalty of dog, the builder of beaver, the power of horse, which is actually a great example of index and how cultures can change it, because when you hear the power of horse, it's real easy to notice and frame it as horsepower, which again is how cultural conventions can transform an idea so quickly. What seems to be consistent, though, is the integrity of the underlying meanings that these symbols represent. For those, the traits had to be observed over time with an analytical mind, along with at least enough awareness to notice the patterns of behavior outside of themselves, which, most folks aren't even aware of their own behaviors now. An example that comes to mind is the groupthink culture that is finding itself being more prevalent and forming around the idea of pseudo-intellectualism, where people are essentially gaining information without the integrity of truth that it may hold. And that kind of leads to a lack of practical wisdom and further muddies the waters of the message that is underlying all these meanings and the meaning we're searching for. Now, a great example of this would be the controversial meeting of Albert Einstein and the Hopi people. And I say it's controversial because historians like to frame this interaction as Einstein showed up for a photo op and didn't talk about science once. End quote. Is how it sounds when you look at a lot of the work. Well, I'm here to say that's just Western history, assuming that indigenous people weren't worth Einstein's knowledge. Yeah, I said it. And when the reality of the situation would be that he was intrigued in the lack of words and symbols regarding time specifically, and that he was even noted to be impressed on how well indigikids, another term I'm coining for the culture, how well indigikids were more readily able to understand his theory of relativity because they were already living relativity. As in, because our creation stories all have the parallel of us coming from the stars, and only for science in the modern day to discover that we're a result of a supernova leaving enough stardust to create a habitable planet and eventually us, it would appear that the intuitive intelligence of the indigenous people began to highlight more concepts that followed that trend. Let's take a look at the lunar calendar, which again stemmed from applied semiotics, where a wise ancestor, thank you, was able to utilize their intuition to make the connection via the index of a turtle shell, having 13 spots on the main shell and 28 tiny spots on the outer ridge to solidify a symbol without separating the object from its oneness. In essence, tracking the lunar cycle and living in relation to, as opposed to using it, they were able to see that we are creation working together. And that would set up the cultural framework of having a symbol that is self-representing, being a great tool for instilling wisdom without diluting the message. And that's not even mentioning that the underlying meaning and integrity of that practice symbolizes the benefits and workings of a matriarchal society. Now, let's keep it 1,000 while we powwow, right? It was a feminine person that discovered that connection because of the menstruation cycle literally following the lunar cycle. Granted, if your hormones are properly regulated. Quick aside, for the masculine who are here and might not like hearing that. First off, grow up. Second, just imagine that every month you get this pain and you bleed out. Practically, you're going to want to know how often that happens. So much so that you notice your environment and see that, wait, I feel this pain during the full moon? Well, when's the next full moon? And again, I am not a representative of the feminine. So my knowledge is only knowledge-based. It is not based in practical wisdom or lived experience. However, using critical thinking, it is very easy to make that connection. So, how would you bridge that gap and prepare future generations with practical wisdom instead of trivial information? Exactly. Instead of waiting 13 months to get the message across, you create an index of something more readily available, like a turtle shell. Need another example? Awesome. I got them. Let's talk about indigenous semiotics regarding elements, right? So many cultures have a variation on how we're comprised of earth, air, water, fire, which comes from the great mystery, aka darkness, and it coming into being, aka the light, which again lines up with some scientific findings. Earth being a representation of the iron in our blood, calcium and phosphorus in our bones, along with a mix of potassium, sulfur, chlorine, and magnesium. Then there's water, represented by the hydrogen and oxygen in oneness, comprising 70% of this vessel we have. And of course, there's air, represented physically as oxygen and carbon dioxide. The one that is most interesting to apply semiotics to, though, is fire. On the surface, it's representing our brain producing electricity, our guts dissolving fuel into nutrients that get broken down even further on the quantum level to feed our mitochondria, which in itself only formed due to a process called endosymbiosis, where long ago, bacteria called aerobic organisms were consumed by anaerobic organisms to create a furnace that literally powers our being. So something that was of the earth and something that worked with air came together to create fire, which loops back to the practice of hunting and harvesting every part of an animal or plant while being reverent and giving permission beforehand. Sounds like the principles of the conservation of energy and mass. Just saying. Bringing my mention of Einstein earlier full circle, why does any of this matter? Again, the aim of this video is to highlight how indigenous peoples were quite literally years ahead of Western medicine science. We see them as the same. We understood so much about abstract concepts that we were able to explain it simply. And that the only reason society led otherwise is due to restrictive nature that semiotics has placed on Western ideologies. I mean, think about it like this. If you had two people, one was colorblind and the other isn't, you show them both the color red. The colorblind person sees gray as you know it, and they will never be able to see it the way you do. However, if both of those people were to see an open wound bleeding, the color wouldn't matter. Only the integrity of the object in the case, it would be the wound bleeding. So the next time you think ancient aliens built something, remember that indigenous people need the benefit of belief that we were smart enough to do it ourselves. Because we did, we're still here even after all the attempts to take us away, and science doesn't know why. So yeah, I'm Benny Cosmic, your subconscious. This has been Amateur Semiotics. In this instance, we are talking about indigenous animal medicines. If you like this series, I am trying to get a feel for what my content will be moving forward. So if you like the idea of semiotics, where in essence, I am looking at the parallels in our world and trying to bridge the gap, because we're so hell-bent on being separated that we're literally, undying ourselves on this planet. So let's be better. And to all my indigifolk, indigikids out there, from one indigenous person to another, you're beautiful. I love you. And yeah,